right, get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into witchcraft and superstitions.
Ooh, sounds spooky.
It is pretty spooky, but we're focusing specifically on southwest Scotland.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What makes this region so special when it comes to witchcraft?
Well, for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at Witchcraft and Superstitious Record in the southwestern district of Scotland.
That sounds like a fascinating primary source. What kind of insights does it offer?
It's packed with first-hand accounts and historical details.
Wow, first-hand accounts. So we're talking about real people's experiences with witchcraft, not just stories and legends.
Exactly. It's more than just spooky stories. Right from the start, it paints this picture of traditional witchcraft in Scotland. We're talking about figures like witches and warlocks.
Okay, now we're getting into classic witch territory. But were these witches and warlocks seen as purely evil figures in this region?
Definitely feared and ostracized. They were linked to evil and all that.
Right, but the book goes deeper than that, right? It talks about these grand, secretive witch festivals, gatherings shrouded in mystery, almost like these large gatherings where witches and warlocks would practice their magic, like a magical convention.
Yeah, kind of. I even found this one poem about Maggie of the Moss from Ayrshire. She would ride a bewitched horse across the sky to get to those gatherings. But Maggie had that nick to gang, through regions dreary, dark, and lang, to hold her orgies.
Hold her orgies. Interesting. But there's another side to it, too, like these smaller, more local gatherings where witches would supposedly make these effigies of their enemies and pierce them with pins.
It's pretty intense stuff. Like
Yeah.
they really believed in the power of those actions to cause harm in the real world.
It's fascinating and a bit terrifying. To think that people truly believed in the power of these acts, it makes you wonder how those beliefs impacted daily life.
One element that stood out to me was how much they believed witches were connected to the sea, especially around the Solway Firth.
The sea, huh? It makes sense, though. The vastness, the unpredictability. It's a natural breeding ground for all sorts of supernatural beliefs.
Totally. The book mentions stories of witches using boats for their rituals, like this woman named Kimmer.
Kimmer, what did she do?
Well, she'd sail out in a magical silver boat at midnight.
A silver boat. Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I know, right? To meet another witch. But when she got back, she was seen burying a horse's skull, and it turned out to be a missing bone belonging to her neighbor.
Whoa, that's creepy. So they believe she used it in some kind of ritual. It's almost like a primitive form of forensics.
Right, it's like they're trying to explain these strange events through the lens of witchcraft. This Kimmer was also believed to influence the luck of fishermen, too, granting good catches or sending them home empty-handed.
So she had power over the sea itself, in their eyes. Feared and respected all at once.
It's a potent combination, that's for sure. But this book doesn't just talk about general beliefs. It actually mentions specific accusations and trials for witchcraft.
Wow, so these weren't just stories. This was real-life stuff with real consequences.
Totally. It shows just how dangerous it was to even be suspected of witchcraft.
Yeah.
Like the story of Moggy Osborne from Wigtownshire, accused of all sorts of things.
But like what? What kind of things were they accusing her of?
They said that heather wouldn't grow where she walked.
Yeah.
Like her presence was literally blighting the land.
Wow, that's a powerful image. And what about those healing witches? Like the woman in Kirkmaiden who healed a bewitched horse and cow.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's like they didn't always see witches as evil. Sometimes they were the ones you turned to for help.
Almost like early healers or shamans. But then you have stories like the Laird of Forrester, right?
Yeah.
He supposedly stumbled upon a whole witch gathering in a church.
I know, right? He said he even recognized some of the women from his village, including the landlady he just had a drink with.
And he only escaped because of his silver spurs, according to the story.
Yep, which makes me think. Silver was often seen as protection against witchcraft, wasn't it? Is there actually any basis for that belief?
It's hard to say. Silver has been associated with purity for a long time. It even has some antibacterial properties, right? So maybe there was a practical element to it that got blown up into a whole mystical belief.
So we've got witches flying, cursing, healing, and gathering in churches. Southwest Scotland was definitely a busy place for the supernatural. But there's one area that really jumps out in the book, the parish of Derry. This place was known for intense supernatural activity.
What made Derry so special?
Both witchcraft and fairies were really prominent there, way more than in other areas.
Okay, so we're adding fairies to the mix now. This is getting interesting. What kind of fairy activity are we talking about?
They had these stories about encounters with the devil himself, almost like it blurred the lines between witchcraft and demonic forces.
Oh, so things are getting even darker now.
Definitely. Like this story about the Reverend Mr. Boyd and his daughter, the devil, became obsessed with his daughter. First, he appeared as a bumblebee.
A bumblebee? That's an odd choice.
I know, right? But then he transformed into this handsome young man, and then he actually tried to kidnap her on a black horse.
It's like a supernatural thriller novel. What happened? Did he succeed?
Well, of course, the Reverend intervened just in time. He saw the devil's cloven hoof at the horse's stirrup.
Whoa, that's a vivid image. So the devil wasn't just some abstract concept. He was a real, tangible threat.
Definitely. It makes you wonder how people coped with all this fear. Did they just hide inside all the time?
Not exactly. The book talks a lot about protection against witchcraft. They believed in charms and counterspells to keep evil away.
Yeah, like the warlock feckets.
Warlock feckets? What are those?
They were special garments, woven from water snake skin under a March moon.
Water snake skin. Sounds fashionable. But back then they thought it made you invincible, or at least protected from witches.
Right, and then there was this ritual to counteract a witch's curse.
What did they do? Sacrifice a goat or something?
Not quite. They would boil a cow's milk with pins and nails in it.
Ouch. Why? What was the point of that?
They believed the witch, who cast the curse, would actually feel the pain of the boiling metal.
So it's like a long-distance revenge tactic. Interesting.
The book even says they used this ritual successfully a few times, too.
Well, that certainly reinforces the belief in counter charms, wouldn't it? But all this talk of witches and the devil, what about the fairies we mentioned earlier? What was their role in all of this?
Right. Let's talk fairies. Were they seen as purely mischievous, or were they more complex figures?
Well, they weren't exactly seen as evil, but they were definitely powerful and capable of causing some trouble.
Okay, so they were more like tricksters, playing pranks and messing with people.
Yeah, pretty much. But the book says they were believed to be remnants of ancient Picts who were driven underground.
Ah, so they have a link to real history. That's fascinating. Blending historical figures with myth and folklore?
That definitely adds another layer to the whole thing. But they weren't always harmless. There's this concept of elf shot, where fairies would use magically crafted bows and arrows to harm cattle or ruin crops. Oh, so they could be dangerous too, not just mischievous.
Definitely farmers were terrified of them.
It makes sense. If your livelihood depended on your livestock or crops, those fairies would represent a very real threat.
And they also had this fear of fairy kidnapping.
Kidnapping? Who are they kidnapping?
Unbaptized infants. They'd switch them with their own changelings.
Oh, wow. That's a classic folktale motif. The changeling child. So how do people protect their babies from these fairy kidnappers?
Well, according to the book, they would place steel objects near newborns and mark their cradles with crosses.
It's amazing how these beliefs affected every aspect of their lives, even the way they cared for their children.
So, with all these potential dangers lurking around every corner, you have to wonder, what kind of encounters did people have with these fairies? Were they all terrifying experiences?
That's what I'm curious about. Did anyone ever claim to have a positive encounter with a fairy?
There was this one story about a man near Portenkill who met a fairy dressed in green carrying a sick child.
A sick child. Oh, that's sad. What did the fairy want?
She asked the man for help.
So she was seeking human assistance. It suggests a more vulnerable side to these creatures, doesn't it?
It does, but the man was too scared to help her.
Even when faced with a plea for help, the fear was too strong. That speaks volumes about how deeply ingrained these beliefs were.
Yeah. And then there's this other tale about a ghostly coach pulled by 6 horses with blue lamps traveling near Port Patrick on Halloween.
Okay, that sounds pretty creepy. A ghostly coach. Was it just a sighting, or did something happen?
It was more of a chilling image that people associated with Halloween.
Right, so it's adding to the whole eerie atmosphere of that night, making it a time when the supernatural world is closer to our own.
Exactly. But speaking of eerie, we can't forget about the wraiths.
Wraiths. What are those? Some kind of ghost?
They're more like supernatural premonitions of death.
Oh, so like omens or harbingers of bad news.
Right, but the book goes into some detail about how accurate they were in predicting deaths.
So these weren't just vague feelings of dread. These were specific sightings that supposedly came true.
Yeah, it's fascinating and chilling at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, there's the tradition of second sight.
Second sight? What does that mean?
The belief that certain people could actually see death coming.
Wow, so like precognitive abilities. That's a heavy burden to carry, seeing death all around you.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just these abstract concepts. The book makes it clear that these beliefs really shaped how communities lived and interacted with each other.
Mm-hmm.
But all this talk about death, it makes you wonder, what were their funeral customs like?
Right. How did they handle death with all these supernatural beliefs swirling around?
They had this practice called walking the dead.
Walking the dead, what does that mean?
It was a vigil kept by friends and family.
So they would stay with the body after death. Why?
Part of it was fear of the dead coming back to life.
Mm.
Makes sense with all the ghosts and spirits we've been talking about.
I can imagine. It makes you wonder if the fear itself, the constant worry about the supernatural, actually shapes their behavior.
And then they had this custom of sin eating, where someone would eat a symbolic meal to take on the sins of the deceased.
Whoa, that's a bit intense. It really emphasizes how much they focus on the afterlife and making sure the deceased had a smooth transition.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they also had the late wake, a gathering after the funeral with food and drinks.
So like a wake, but maybe a bit more lively.
Yeah, it started as a solemn thing, but seems to have evolved into a bit more of a celebration.
It's interesting how death rituals often blend grief with celebration. Maybe it's a way of acknowledging both the sadness of loss and the continuation of life.
But it wasn't just the rituals. Even their burial practices had superstitions tied to them. Like if someone committed suicide, they would bury them at a crossroads
Crossroads, why there?
because they thought it would stop their spirit from haunting their home.
Ah, so even in death, they were trying to control these supernatural forces. And what about the north-facing burial grounds? Why were those avoided?
They associated the north with evil. They even avoided putting windows on the north side of churches.
Wow, so it's not just individual practices. This belief system impacted the way they designed their buildings, too. It really emphasizes how deeply embedded these beliefs were in their culture. But we've talked a lot about the darker side of things. What about ghost stories? Were there any particularly creepy haunted places in southwest Scotland?
Oh, there are tons. Practically every place had its own ghost story, it seems. And the details? Oh, they're chilling.
Let's hear some of those spooky tales then.
Well, why don't we take a little break and come back with a fresh batch of ghost stories?
All right, sounds good to me. We'll be back soon with more tales from the supernatural side of southwest Scotland.
Okay, so where were we? Ah, yes, ghost stories. And believe me, this book has plenty of them. Seems like every corner of southwest Scotland had its own resident spook.
I know, right? I feel like we've only scratched the surface. What other ghostly tales in this book really caught your attention?
Well, there's one from Stonykirk Parish about this thing called the Lodnagapol Plantain.
The what?
A Lodnagapol plant. It's haunted by a headless woman carrying a light. Okay, a headless woman. That's creepy enough on its own.
But it gets creepier. This light, they say, lures travelers into these dangerous moss holes nearby.
Oh, so it's not just a ghost story. It's like a supernatural warning, too.
Exactly. It's like the land itself is trying to tell you to be careful. Speaking of warnings, what about that story of the ghostly lover?
Oh, yeah, the guy who kept getting visits from his dead girlfriend.
All dressed in white, right. That's classic ghost story material.
The thing is, he wasn't too happy about these visits. He actually tried to break up with the ghost.
Wait, break up with a ghost? How do you even do that?
We asked a friend to hide in his garden and throw a bucket of water at her.
A bucket of water? Seriously?
Yeah, he thought it would break the spell or something. Yeah. Talk about an awkward situation for the friend. Hey, can you come over and chuck some water at my dead girlfriend?
It's fascinating, though, right? It shows how people back then approached ghosts differently. It wasn't just about fear. They were trying to manage these encounters, even negotiate with the spirits.
So not all ghosts are scary, right? This book also mentions this ghostly horseman in the Macars district.
Oh, yeah. This guy was just going about his business, riding around on his gray horse.
He wasn't trying to frighten anyone.
And the book even says he would tie his horse up to ropes hanging from the thatch of houses.
Can you imagine waking up to a ghost horse in your garden?
It's a good reminder that not all supernatural encounters are negative. Some of them are just strange occurrences, like a glitch in the Matrix.
Okay, well, I've got one that's a bit more on the eerie side. The story of the doctor's ghost from the Tirely area.
What did that ghost do?
It roamed around the seashore, and people found it so unsettling that the tenant renting the doctor's old house actually moved out.
Wow, that's hardcore. It really shows how much these beliefs impacted people's lives. It wasn't just about stories. It affected their decisions, their homes, everything. And, one that always sticks with me is that story of the plague-stricken Pac-Man.
Oh, the one who's buried alive.
Yeah, with all his wares because people were so terrified of the plague spreading. That's so sad. It's a reminder of how real those fears were back then.
It's less of a ghost story and more of a historical tragedy. But they say his grave is still haunted by strange lights and sounds. It's like the fear and sorrow from that time still linger there.
What about that one with the spectral carriage and horses from that farm, Claunch, was it?
Yeah, the farm of Claunch. They say this ghostly carriage and 2 horses would appear out of nowhere.
Classic phantom vehicle. Those pop up in ghost stories all over the world, don't they?
Blacksmith said he encountered them one night while walking home to Withorn.
Under a full moon, I bet.
You got it. It's like moonlight just amps up the creepiness factor in all these stories.
Yeah.
It's like a spotlight on the supernatural.
Okay, last one before we move on. What about the story of the old parish manse of Withorn? The one that was supposedly avoided after dark.
Yeah, it was said to be haunted, but the details are pretty vague. Something about a ghostly presence connected to some past crime or tragedy. It's almost like the land itself was holding on to the memory of that event.
It's like those places where you just feel a sense of unease, like something bad happened there, even if you don't know the history.
So we've got haunted houses, phantom carriages, and plague victims. But there's one more type of story that's all over this book. Hauntings that stem from some kind of reckless act, like tempting fate. Have you come across those?
Oh, definitely. It's like people back then had a healthy respect for the power of the supernatural, or at least a healthy fear of it.
Yeah, like the story of that young man who made a bet he could ride to the Maiden Kirk in the middle of the night and steal the church Bible.
Oh, yeah, that one. Talk about asking for trouble. What happened to him?
Well, he never came back. The next morning, they found his body all mangled near the kirk, still clutching the Bible.
It's a classic case of curiosity killing the cat, or in this case, disrespecting the sacred leading to a gruesome end.
And it didn't end there. His death led to the Maiden Kirk becoming haunted. People started seeing his ghost wandering around the ruins.
It's like his reckless act not only cost him his life, but also cursed the place itself, leaving behind a sense of unease and fear. It's interesting how often those two things are linked in these stories. Disrespecting the supernatural leads to real-world consequences. So we have haunted kirks, plague victims, and ghost horses. But what's the overall takeaway from all these stories? Why do you think they're so enduring?
For me, it's about stepping back in time and trying to understand how people experienced the world centuries ago. They didn't have the scientific explanations we have today. These stories were their way of making sense of things, of explaining the unexplainable.
Right. It's like a window into their worldview. It's easy to dismiss it all as just superstition, but for them, these beliefs were very real and very powerful. And I think there's something universal about that human need to find meaning and order in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable.
Exactly. Even if we don't believe in ghosts and witches anymore, there's still that part of us that's drawn to the mystery, to the possibility that there's more to this world than we can see or understand. I mean, that's probably why we're so fascinated by these stories even today, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that these stories weren't just about fear. They were also about wonder, about trying to make sense of the world around them. They were a way of connecting with something bigger than themselves. But there's one story we haven't touched on yet that I think deserves its own attention. It's the story of the Devil of Glenluce. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah. That's the one where a whole family was tormented by a malevolent spirit, right?
Exactly. And what makes this one so fascinating is the level of detail. It goes beyond just sightings or rumors. The book actually includes conversations and dialogues recorded by those who witnessed these events.
It's like reading a first-hand account of a 17th century haunting. You can almost feel the fear and confusion they must have experienced.
So let's dive into the story. What exactly happened to this family in Glenluce? Take us through it.
Okay, ready to dive into part 3 of this deep dive. We've talked about witches, fairies, ghosts, all sorts of things. But this book, Witchcraft and Superstitious Record in the Southwestern District of Scotland, it doesn't just stop there. There's a whole other category of stories in here that are just, well, strange, unexplained phenomena, things that make you wonder.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, well, one thing that pops up a lot is prophetic dreams, but not just regular dreams. We're talking vivid, unsettling dreams that seem to predict the future.
Like premonitions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like there's this one story about a woman in Kirkham who had a dream about a coffin being carried into her neighbor's house.
Oh, that's not good.
No, not at all. And the thing is, she didn't know of anyone being sick or anything. But a few days later, one of her neighbors actually died.
Is that a coincidence? Or something more? I mean, it's like those stories you hear about people having a bad feeling before something bad happens. It really makes you wonder, right? What's going on in our brains? Could there be some kind of connection between our minds and, I don't know, the fabric of reality, something that lets us see glimpses of the future?
Now that's spooky. But dreams are dreams. Visions are even weirder, right? People actually seeing things.
Oh, absolutely. Visions, apparitions, ghostly figures, it's all in there. And not just quick glimpses either. We're talking about detailed visions, things that really stuck with people.
Like that story of the ghostly funeral procession near Barwell-Ante, right?
Yes, that one's wild. It wasn't just a single ghost, it was a whole procession. Hearse, mourners, the whole shebang. And they weren't just standing there, they were moving, following the exact route a real funeral would take to the churchyard.
Okay, now that's just creepy. It's like watching a dress rehearsal for a real funeral, but with ghosts.
It makes you question everything you think you know about what's real, you know? What if our minds are more powerful than we realize? What if we can actually tap into something beyond our normal senses?
Okay, well, I've got one that's even weirder than a ghost funeral. The story of the ghostly light in Colvin. This wasn't just a flicker or a glow. People described it as a ball of fire, zipping through the air.
A ball of fire. That sounds familiar. Unexplained lights have been reported for centuries. Some people say it's ball lightning. Others talk about UFOs. Who knows?
It's definitely one of those things that make you go, huh, what was that? But all these ghosts and lights in the sky are getting a bit too much for me.
Right.
What about something a little more down to earth? Didn't the book mention some strange things happening with animals, too?
Yes. Animals pop up a lot in these stories, almost like they have a sixth sense, you know, like they can pick up on things that humans can't.
Like that creepy black dog with glowing eyes near Delray. That was a bad omen, right?
Oh yeah, the phantom black dog. A classic. It's not just Scotland either. Black dog myths are all over the world, usually a sign of death or misfortune.
Okay, I'm officially spooked now. What other animal stories did they have?
Well, there's the tale of the bewitched cow in Twineholm. This cow just suddenly got sick, wouldn't eat or drink. You know what they blamed it on.
Witches. What else? Did they do the milk and pins thing again?
Yep, boiled milk with pins and needles. Supposedly, the witch would feel the pain and lift the curse.
So it's like a long-distance voodoo doll, but with milk. It's a bit out there, but it shows how resourceful they were. If you believe in magic, why not try to use it to your advantage?
Exactly. They were working with what they had, but beyond curses, there were stories about animals acting strangely before storms or deaths, like they could sense something was coming.
It's like they're tuned into something we're not, some kind of deeper energy or force. But I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Witches, fairies, ghosts, prophetic dreams, bewitched cows. Southwest Scotland was a wild place, supernaturally speaking. So what's the big takeaway for you? What do we make of all these stories?
Well, I think they offer a fascinating glimpse into a different way of thinking, a different way of experiencing the world. For these people, the supernatural wasn't just a story. It was a part of their reality. It shaped their beliefs, their actions, their whole lives.
It's easy for us to look back and say, oh, that's just superstition. But for them, it was about making sense of the world, finding explanations for things they didn't understand. It's like their version of science, in a way.
Right. And even if we don't believe in witches and fairies anymore, there's still something about these stories that resonates with us. I think it speaks to that deep-seated human need for wonder, for mystery, for something beyond the everyday.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's healthy to keep a little bit of that wonder alive, even in our modern world. To not dismiss everything we can't immediately explain. Who knows? Maybe there are forces at work that we're just not equipped to understand yet.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, some of these old stories hold a grain of truth, a hint of something beyond our current understanding. So the next time you find yourself in a dark, quiet place, think about the stories we've discussed and ask yourself, what if? What if there's more to our world than we can see or touch?
What if those whispers in the wind are more than just the wind? What if those shadows dancing in the corner of your eye are something else entirely? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the supernatural side of Southwest Scotland. It's been a spooky, thought-provoking journey. And who knows, maybe you'll start seeing the world a little differently now. Until next time, keep exploring those mysteries and keep that sense of wonder alive.